They never saw me, but they will see us now." The words carried down the narrow aisle of the bus at 7 a.m., flat and unshaken, cutting through the drone of the engine. Dozens of small faces turned toward the front, their voices breaking into silence. Outside, fog smothered the streets, thick enough to erase landmarks, leaving only the skeletal frame of the bridge rising ahead. Marcus Reed's hands locked on the wheel, his knuckles bone white. The brass key on its lanyard swung against his chest in rhythm with the vibration of the floor. He did not glance into the mirror, his eyes fixed forward, unblinking. For years he had driven this vehicle with steady precision. This morning his grip had changed. The children shifted uneasily. A girl pressed her palms to the glass, her breath leaving fogged circles that dissolved into the white outside. A boy clutched his backpack against his chest as though fabric and straps could serve as armor. One tried the rear handle, the door did not move. The lock clicked earlier, subtle but final. The bridge rose out of the mist, its beams wet and dark, steel glistening under the weak glow of street lamps. The sound of tires on slick pavement grew sharper, higher in pitch as the bus accelerated. The floor trembled, lunchboxes rattled from laps into the aisle. Inside, the smell of vinyl and diesel thickened, cut only by the sound of children beginning to cry. Marcus leaned slightly in his seat, his face half turned toward the rows. His mouth pulled into something between a smile and a grimace, a fleeting distortion that revealed nothing of comfort. Behind him, voices climbed from whispers to shouts, thin and desperate, overlapping until they became indistinguishable from the engine's roar. The guardrail appeared in the headlights, slick with condensation, a final line across the fog. The bus did not slow. The impact came with a scream of tearing metal, sparks cutting brief orange arcs against the white void. For a fraction of a second the front lifted, weight suspended, the interior tilting as bodies lurched forward. Then gravity reclaimed everything. The yellow bus broke through the barrier, vanishing into the mist. The last sound was a chorus of screams drowned by the roar of the river waiting below. At 6 a.m., the depot lot stirred awake with the low growl of diesel engines, exhaust clouds rising like pale ghosts into the morning air. Marcus Reed arrived as he always did, early, uniform jacket zipped to the neck, cap pulled low. He moved without hurry, his steps practiced, each motion part of a ritual that had repeated across 15 years of service. To the others he was reliable, a figure who seemed carved into the routine of the school system itself. His brass key slid into the ignition, and the bus answered him with a shuddering cough before settling into a steady hum. That sound, for hundreds of parents, meant their children's day had begun safely. He was 48, a veteran of another life where uniforms were pressed and orders were given in the heat of foreign deserts. The discipline remained. Behind the wheel he showed the same restraint, the same quiet patience. His face rarely shifted. The mask was calm, neutral, steady. Children learned to trust it. Parents leaned on it. The city counted on it without thinking. At 6:30 a.m., the first stop filled with waiting figures bundled against the cold. A boy ran, shoelaces untied, breath fogging in quick bursts. Marcus held the bus a moment longer, eyes steady in the mirror until the boy climbed aboard. "Seat belt," he said, the single word enough. The click of plastic buckles followed him down the aisle. The ritual continued at every corner. He slowed for the elderly woman who crossed with a cane. He waited the extra beat for the girl whose mother's alarm clock always failed. Each small pause folded itself into the larger rhythm of a man who, to the outside eye, never failed. Teachers waved when he arrived at the loop near 7:40 a.m., their coffee cups lifted like signals. "Morning, Marcus," they said, and his nod was both greeting and promise. Parents spoke of him to one another, calling him the gentle one, the patient one, the man who never raised his voice. In the staff lounge, colleagues called him the clock because his arrivals were precise, his departures dependable. No one doubted him. He was the trusted protector, the ordinary anchor in a system of constant rush. Inside the bus, Children told stories to each other with the easy assurance that nothing would happen as long as Marcus sat at the wheel. His silence was never read as distance, but as presence. The hum of the engine, the faint smell of oil and vinyl, the reflection of their faces in the wide rearview mirror, all of it stitched together by his stillness. His mask worked flawlessly. On certain mornings, when fog drifted low across the streets, his silhouette became part of the landscape, framed by the wide glass and the yellow hull. From porches, parents waved not just to the bus but to him specifically, as if sending their children into his care was safer than sending them into the care of the school itself. Trust, built quietly, required no announcement. It existed in the smallest gestures: a raised hand, a nod, a glance into the mirror. There were moments when his humanity flickered through the mask. He once slipped a sweet roll from his pocket onto the seat of a boy who confessed he had skipped breakfast. He once returned a lost glove to a girl before she noticed it missing, holding it out wordlessly, the wool folded neatly. To the community, these were kindnesses that confirmed what they already believed, that Marcus Reed was more than dependable, that he was good. But the mask never dropped fully. Behind the glass his face was composed, eyes scanning the road, lips pressed into a thin line. In the depot, colleagues noticed little about him beyond his punctuality. He spoke rarely, laughed almost never. What they remembered most was not conversation but presence. The man in the corner who never failed to turn up, who never asked for help, who never betrayed frustration. He was easy to rely on because he never showed strain. At 8 a.m., after the morning loop, he parked the bus in its stall, engine ticking as it cooled. The brass key swung once against his chest before he slid it into his pocket. Around him, the lot buzzed with engines shutting down, radios crackling with schedules. Marcus walked toward the office door, footsteps echoing on concrete, as anonymous as any other worker leaving a shift. To anyone watching, he was exactly what he had always been: steady, reliable, invisible. The city built its trust on that invisibility. Parents continued their mornings without a second thought. Children assumed the bus would always arrive. Teachers marked attendance and never wondered if the clock could break. The mask remained intact, seamless, unchallenged. Yet the rearview mirror above his seat told another story. Its glass bore a thin crack in one corner, silver separating from black, catching the light with a faint glint. To the children it was nothing. To Marcus, it was a fracture he did not name. Each morning it grew a fraction wider, splitting his reflection into two halves, protector on one side, something else on the other. The mask still covered him, but the crack remained, waiting for the day when the glass would no longer hold. At 9 p.m. the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old pipes in the walls. Marcus Reed sat at the small table pressed against the window, a chipped mug between his hands. The coffee inside had long gone cold, a thin skin forming at the surface, but he lifted it anyway, swallowing the bitterness as if it could pass for dinner. The single bulb above his head flickered once before holding steady, casting a pale light across a stack of envelopes spread like discarded cards. Their red stamps shouted the same words: overdue, final notice, disconnection warning. He no longer opened them. He knew what waited inside. The apartment carried the smell of damp plaster and stale air. Paint peeled along the seams of the walls. A crack began near the ceiling and traveled down toward the baseboard, jagged and patient, spreading farther with every season. At night, Marcus stared at it the way others stared at clocks. It was a line of erosion, proof that even stone and wood could not endure forever. Years earlier, the rooms had been filled with different sounds: the low clatter of his wife cooking, the chatter of a boy filling the hall with laughter, the music of television shows that marked the hours of the evening. Then silence replaced it all. His wife had left first, her departure quiet, no shouting, no slammed doors. Just suitcases loaded into the trunk of a car and a final look that carried more fatigue than anger. She took their son with her to another state, chasing steadiness that Marcus could not offer. Letters came in the months after, written in the uneven hand of a child learning his way across paper. I scored a goal today, Dad. I learned fractions. I miss you. The envelope smelled faintly of crayons, sometimes decorated with stickers of rockets or animals. Marcus stacked them in the drawer beside the bed. He read them more than once, but his hands never reached for a pen. He told himself words would only expose his failures, that his boy should not know the details of empty cupboards or eviction threats. Better silence than confession. On the bus his mask never slipped. Parents saw the same quiet nod, the same steady hands on the wheel. Children never suspected the man who smiled at them in the mornings returned each night to an apartment stripped of warmth. In that two-story building lined with narrow corridors, Marcus existed as a shadow. Neighbors rarely saw him. The landlord knew him only through the record of late payments stacked in a file. To the city, he was invisible once he stepped off the bus. The refrigerator groaned as the motor shut down, leaving the room in a hush broken only by the buzz of the light. Marcus set the mug down and rubbed at his face. His fingers traced the ridge of a scar near his temple, a mark from a military life few remembered he had lived. He had once worn medals, once been called sergeant, once believed that service guaranteed respect. Now his uniform was polyester, his badge a brass key, his reward an empty kitchen and a table buried in warnings. At 11 p.m. the building settled into deeper quiet. Somewhere below, a television clicked off. The radiator hissed before going still. Marcus stood and crossed to the window, staring at the parking lot lit by a single yellow street lamp. The light hummed, insects tapping against its casing. Beyond the glow, everything disappeared into black. He pressed his forehead to the glass and let the cold bite at his skin. Behind him, the crack in the wall caught the light. Its shadow stretched long across the floor, a crooked line that looked almost like a fracture in the earth itself. He turned back toward it and stared until his eyes blurred. The silence was absolute. Only the image of the crack remained, widening slowly, patiently, a mark no one else would see. It waited, dark and steady, promising that something, sooner or later, would give way. The memo came on a thin sheet of paper, folded once, the ink already smudged where too many hands had pressed it flat. Marcus read it beneath the humming fluorescent light of the depot office at 6 a.m. The faint smell of burned coffee drifting from a pot left too long on its element. The language was clipped, official, written in the detached cadence of bureaucracy. He was reassigned. Route 19, the downtown artery, was no longer his. In its place was Route 47, the outer loop, a stretch that circled warehouses, scrap lots, and half-empty streets. The drivers called it the dead line, a run for rookies and the discarded. He folded the paper once more, slid it into his jacket, and waited. Across the desk, the supervisor spoke without looking at him. "If you don't like it, you can leave." The words were flat, delivered as if they had been spoken before to others whose names were already forgotten. Marcus gave no reply. The mask remained still, but the silence pressed against him like a hand at his throat. The meeting ended in minutes. No acknowledgement of his record, no mention of the storms he had driven through, the years of punctuality, the children he had waited for in the rain. Only the thin sheet of paper. Outside, frost coated the windows of the buses lined in rows. He touched the brass key on his lanyard, the symbol of his years behind the wheel, and felt its teeth bite faintly into his palm. By the end of the month, the numbers betrayed him. The new route cut hours, stripped overtime, and hollowed his paycheck until the weight of his debts grew unbearable. The stack of envelopes on his kitchen table leaned higher, their red stamps bleeding urgency. Notices from the bank carried dates like ultimatums. At 9 p.m. he sat with another mug of coffee, bitter and cold, staring at the letters that promised eviction. Each word was a reminder that stability had been taken from him not with violence, but with indifference. The deadline lived up to its name. At 7 a.m. the bus rattled past warehouses with windows boarded in plywood, past gravel lots where rusted machinery sagged in the cold. Few passengers boarded, their silence filling the space more completely than conversation ever had. Sometimes the seats were nearly empty for the entire loop, the sound of the engine echoing against itself in a hollow cabin. Gone were the voices of children, the small greetings, the raised hands of parents. In their place was vacancy. He drove in circles through industrial corridors that felt like abandoned arteries of a forgotten body. He thought back to other uniforms. There had been a time when he stood in desert heat, sand lifting in sheets, his name called with respect, his presence recorded. Orders had meaning, camaraderie was tangible. He carried the weight of service with pride, believing that fairness was the natural reward of loyalty. Now his uniform was polyester, his badge a key, his orders delivered through paper memos. The mask he wore was no longer one of discipline but of survival, its seams stretched thin. At 5 p.m., when his shift ended, he sat in the driver's seat long after the engine was cut. The depot lot emptied, other drivers moving toward the office or their cars, their voices trailing off. Marcus remained in silence, his palms resting on the wheel, the brass key dangling motionless against his chest. He stared into the mirror above him. His reflection was bisected by the crack in the glass, a thin fracture that had widened since the week before. One side of his face remained calm, the mask still intact. The other half split into shadow, unrecognizable, as if belonging to someone else entirely. That night the refrigerator hummed and clicked in his apartment before shutting off. He lit no lights except the bulb above the table. The notices lay spread across the surface like a battlefield, every envelope a reminder of his erasure. The crack in the wall extended further down, jagged and sure, cutting the plaster in two. He traced it with his eyes, following its crooked path, and thought of the line in the mirror. He remembered the supervisor's voice, precise and merciless. "If you don't like it, you can leave." The words echoed against the bare walls, repeating themselves until they sounded less like a sentence and more like a verdict. At 11 p.m. the building settled into silence, the pipes stilling, the hallway dim. Marcus remained at the table, unmoving, the brass key on the lanyard pressed into his palm. It left small red marks across his skin, shallow wounds that faded quickly but returned each night. He stared at the crack on the wall until the plaster's shadow stretched into the shape of a fault line, dividing the room in two. Somewhere inside him, the fracture deepened in the same way, silent, invisible, waiting for its collapse. The notice was taped to his door when he returned at 8 p.m., its edges curled from the damp air in the hallway. The paper was blunt, stripped of sympathy. 30 days to vacate. The landlord's signature scrawled across the bottom like a knife mark. Marcus tore it free and held it in his hand as he stepped into the apartment. The air inside was heavy with silence, the radiator ticking faintly in the corner. He placed the paper on the kitchen table among the unpaid bills, another addition to a pile that had grown into a monument of failure. That night he did not make coffee. He sat in the chair and stared at the wall. The crack had lengthened again, creeping toward the floor like a slow wound splitting the building open. He traced it with his eyes until the plaster blurred, until the notice on the table became the only thing in focus. The words were simple, the verdict final: 30 days. The following morning the bus lot was still wet from rain. Marcus took his seat at 6 a.m., the smell of damp vinyl clinging to the cabin. The route ran its empty loop past warehouses and chain-link fences slick with water. At the third stop a parent was waiting, arms crossed, lips tight. The man climbed the steps with his daughter, his voice sharp. "You're late again," he snapped. The child shrank back, clutching her lunchbox. Marcus met the parent's eyes only for a second. He gave no reply. The words slid past the mask, but inside they caught and stayed. At 2 p.m. the depot manager called him into the office. The room smelled of dust and cheap disinfectant. The manager held a clipboard, tapping it with a pen. "We've had complaints," he said. "Keep the schedule, no excuses." The tone was cold, rehearsed. Marcus nodded once. The conversation ended without further words. Outside, the sound of buses idling filled the air, but to him it felt like static, meaningless noise. By 9 p.m. he was back in the apartment. The eviction notice lay under his hand, the red stamps of overdue bills scattered like wounds across the table. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a notebook with a worn cover. The pages smelled faintly of dust and ink. He opened it and wrote in slow, deliberate letters, "They will notice me, even if it's the last thing they do." He pressed the pen harder than necessary, the words cutting deep grooves into the paper. The act was quiet, but something shifted as the sentence settled. For years his resentment had lived in silence, suppressed beneath the mask he wore for the city. That night it took shape on the page, no longer thought but declaration. The notebook closed with a soft thud. His hand lingered on its cover, the brass key from his lanyard resting beside it, the two objects forming a strange pair, one symbol of duty, the other of resolve. At 11 p.m. the building's hallway was still. Through the thin walls he heard a neighbor's muffled laughter, a television somewhere playing too loud. He turned off his own light and sat in the dark. The eviction notice glowed faintly under the spill of street lamp light through the window. The crack in the wall seemed wider in the shadows, jagged as a scar. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the mask stripped away by the darkness. His face was empty, unreadable, eyes fixed on nothing. But on the table the notebook remained, its last written line a silent promise. The refrigerator clicked, the sound hollow in the quiet. The light from the hallway seeped under the door, illuminating the notice pinned against the pile of bills. 30 days. He reached out, folded the paper once, and placed it inside the notebook. The cover closed again, hiding both the order to leave and the words he had carved into its page. The night settled heavy, the silence unbroken. Only the crack on the wall remained visible, its shadow stretching long across the floor. In its crooked outline the room seemed divided, two halves pulling apart. One side still clung to routine, to the brass key and the bus that awaited him at dawn. The other had already crossed into something darker, a place where silence no longer endured. He sat without moving, the notebook beneath his hand, the eviction notice pressed inside. The mask might return in the morning, but tonight the fracture had widened. In the glow of the street lamp, the crack in the wall looked less like damage and more like a path, leading forward into a place where nothing would remain unseen. At 6 a.m. the depot was drowned in fog, the kind that clung to every surface and turned the row of yellow buses into hulking silhouettes. Engines coughed awake one by one, but bus 47 sat still, waiting. Marcus Reed approached without hurry, his boots striking the damp concrete, the brass key swinging against his chest. He climbed the steps and paused in the silence of the cabin, his hand brushing along the rail as if confirming its shape. The inspection was precise. He reached for the emergency latch above the rear window, pressed it once, and slipped the pin free so that from the outside it appeared functional, but inside it would never move. The rear door was next. He engaged the mechanical lock with a slow twist of metal, the click swallowed by the fog outside. Beneath the driver's seat, wrapped in a cloth bag, he slid a small can of gasoline into the shadows. It settled with a dull thud, hidden but present, its faint odor masked by the stronger scent of diesel. Every detail was deliberate. At 6:40 a.m. he turned the ignition. The bus shuddered, engine vibrating the floor, headlights pushing two narrow beams into the mist. He adjusted the mirror, watching his own face fracture across the crack in the glass. For a moment he lingered on the split reflection, then lowered his eyes to the road ahead. His hand moved to the radio, the old box crackling before releasing the low hum of a gospel hymn. The voices were worn, solemn, carrying the weight of funerals rather than mournings. The sound filled the bus, a requiem disguised as routine. At 7 a.m. the first children arrived. They ran through the fog, backpacks bouncing, lunchboxes clutched in small hands. Marcus opened the door with a hiss of hydraulics. "Morning, Mr. Reed," one said, breathless. He nodded, his mask intact. Shoes squeaked on the rubber floor as they climbed the steps, voices light, unaware. Stop by stop the seats filled. A girl unwrapped her breakfast bar and shared it with a friend. Two boys argued over a trading card. A younger child hummed along absent-mindedly with the radio, not knowing the tune was not a song for beginnings but for endings. The cabin warmed with the heat of bodies, the windows fogging at the edges where cold air pressed from outside. At 7:20 a.m., a mother placed her hand on the side of the bus as her son boarded. "Take care of him," she said without raising her voice. Marcus met her eyes briefly through the glass and nodded. The door shut with finality. The bus pulled away from the curb, the boy already laughing at something down the aisle. Through the mirror, Marcus watched them settle. Backpacks shoved under seats, coats shrugged off, chatter spilling into the air. To them this was another morning, another safe ride. To him it was ritual breaking. His foot pressed lightly on the accelerator, the hymn from the radio swelling, voices of the dead carried forward into fog. The city was muted under the mist, familiar landmarks blurred. Street lamps hung in the gray like faint orbs, traffic sounds swallowed until only the hum of the engine remained. Inside, the gospel hymn played on, its refrain circling like a tolling bell. A boy near the front tapped the beat against his knee, turning lament into rhythm. At 7:30 a.m., the bus rolled past a bakery, the smell of fresh bread faint in the fog. Normally, he would have slowed for the girl whose mother always rushed late, but not today. He kept moving, the stop skipped, the girl absent. No one questioned it. The chatter continued, the hymn swelled. He checked the mirror again. The crack split his face into halves, protector on one side, betrayer on the other. The children's reflections framed around his, their small shapes blurred by the fractured glass. He adjusted nothing, eyes steady. The hymn reached its chorus, voices layering into something heavy, almost suffocating. He turned the volume slightly higher. The sound filled the bus, pressing against the chatter until both blended into a strange harmony, laughter braided with lament. At 7:40 a.m., the bus reached the intersection where it should have turned toward the school. The road stretched left, familiar, filled with early traffic. Straight ahead was fog and silence, the industrial edge of the city. His hands tightened on the wheel. The mask did not move. The children continued their small rituals unaware. A girl tied her shoelace. A boy dug for a pencil in his backpack. A younger child stared at the foggy window, tracing circles in the condensation with her finger. The hymn ended in a long, trailing note, and the cabin fell briefly into silence. Marcus reached to the radio dial and reset the track. The same hymn began again, slower this time, the opening bars dragging like chains across the air. The bus moved forward, not left. The chatter dimmed for a moment as a few children looked up, surprised by the change in rhythm. None spoke yet. Marcus's eyes did not shift from the road. In the rearview mirror, the crack widened in the glow of the morning light, a thin fracture stretching deeper into the silver. Behind it, the reflections of the children shimmered faintly, their faces fractured by the same line. The bus rumbled onward into the fog, the hymn repeating, each note heavier than the last, as if the music itself was aware of what waited beyond the mist. At 7:45 a.m., bus 47 left the grid of familiar streets. The houses and corner stores fell behind, their outlines swallowed by fog, until the windows framed only silence and industrial decay. The tires struck uneven pavement, the vibration carrying through the floor into the children's shoes. The chatter began to falter, small voices tapering into questions unspoken. One boy leaned forward from the second row, his hand gripping the seat in front of him. "Mr. Reed," he asked, voice uncertain, "this isn't the way to school, is it?" The words hung in the air, fragile and expectant. Marcus's eyes did not shift from the road. His answer came low, flat, barely audible above the hum of the engine. "No school today, only the last lesson." The sentence dropped like lead into the cabin. For a moment it seemed no one had heard, yet the silence that followed confirmed they had. The hymn on the radio continued, voices weighted with grief, a choir for the condemned. The children glanced at one another, eyes wide, but none rose from their seats. The road ahead stretched straight into the fog, lined with rusting warehouses whose windows stared blank and hollow. Chain-link fences slumped under their own weight, topped with strands of barbed wire that glistened faintly with condensation. Utility poles marched in crooked rows, their wires sagging, humming faintly with unseen current. To the children it was a landscape stripped of life, as if they had been carried into another world where no one lived and no one waited. The engine grew louder in the hush, each rotation of the wheels pounding like a slow heartbeat. The floor rattled, lunchboxes sliding fractionally across the aisle. One girl clutched her backpack tightly to her chest, rocking slightly as though bracing against turbulence. A boy at the back tried to laugh, the sound thin and misplaced, but it broke apart before it reached anyone else. At 7:50 a.m., the bus passed beneath a rail bridge, its steel frame streaked with rust, the graffiti barely legible through the fog. The sound changed briefly, hollow, metallic, echoing like the inside of a drum. For the children, it was the moment they realized the journey had become something else entirely, not a detour, not an accident, but a path no one had chosen but the man behind the wheel. Another child spoke, her voice trembling. "Please, can we turn back?" Marcus remained silent. His jaw tightened, his hands unmoving, his gaze locked forward. The mask was in place, expressionless, but the radio's hymn seemed to answer in his stead, the repeated refrain rising until it swallowed the request. The bus turned onto a service road that wound deeper into the district. The buildings grew larger, hulks of corrugated steel and broken glass, surrounded by lots where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. The fences that bordered them rose higher, the coils of razor wire sharper against the mist. The children shifted in their seats, some craning to see out the fogged windows, others staring only at the back of the driver's head, waiting for it to turn, to reveal a trace of the man they once knew. At 7:55 a.m., the silence inside the bus became heavier than the fog outside. Breathing was audible, short and fast, punctuated by the shuffle of feet on the rubber floor. The gospel voices continued, patient and relentless, their tone unchanging as the landscape grew more desolate. Marcus adjusted nothing. The wheel remained steady in his grip, the mask unbroken, the fractured mirror above his head splitting his face into halves, guardian in one shard, stranger in the other. The children no longer spoke. Their questions had turned into a watchful quiet, the kind that presses against the chest and makes the air thin. The scenery outside blurred into repetition, warehouse after warehouse, fence after fence, poles and wires stretching like ribs of a carcass. Each landmark looked like the last, a loop with no escape. At 8 a.m. the road narrowed. Fog swallowed the distance, but in its brief clearings the children saw skeletal cranes, idle machines leaning at angles, shipping containers stacked like tombs. The industrial wasteland stretched on, unbroken, until it seemed they had entered a place without return. Inside, the radio hymn reached its chorus again, the voices climbing, mourning something not yet gone but already certain. The sound filled every corner, pressing against the silence of the children, until it was impossible to tell whether the music came from the speakers or from the walls themselves. Marcus did not speak again. His silence carried the weight of finality. The bus pressed forward, deeper into the fog, deeper into the dead district of the city, until the ordinary world seemed lost behind them. The crack in the rearview mirror caught the dim light of morning, splitting his reflection cleanly into two. In one shard the face of the protector remained, calm, steady. In the other shard the face was hollow, stripped of recognition. The children watched the road ahead, the fences, the warehouses, and the poles, until they began to resemble not landmarks but warnings. At 8:05 a.m. the service road curved, rising faintly. The fog shifted, revealing something massive ahead. The steel frame of a bridge appeared, its outline dark against the pale sky. The children gasped softly, a collective intake of breath that broke the silence for only a moment. Then all sound returned to the hum of the engine, and the hymn repeating its endless refrain. At 8:10 a.m., the bridge loomed larger, its black steel vanishing upward into fog. Inside the bus the hymn continued, low and steady, its voices like a procession of mourners moving down a street no one else could see. The children sat rigid, their silence broken only by quickened breaths and the occasional squeak of shoes against the floor. Then from the back row, a sound, metal rattling faintly. A boy, older than the rest, had risen from his seat and gripped the rear handle. Pulled once. Nothing moved. He pulled again, harder, his shoulders straining. The latch did not budge. Others rose to help. Two boys yanked at the same handle, their faces flushed with effort. A girl reached for the emergency lever above the window, tugged it downward, and heard only the dead click of metal against metal. The mechanism was unresponsive. Another tried the roof hatch, her fingers slipping against its grip, but the bolts Marcus had placed there the night before held it firm. One by one the attempts ended the same way, a hollow clatter that gave no release. The silence cracked into panic. A cry broke from the back, then another, until the cabin filled with high, sharp voices. Feet stamped against the floor. Hands struck the windows. The glass trembled but held, its reinforced surface scattering the force back into their palms. At 8:12 a.m., a small girl pressed her hands against the window and screamed, "I want my mom." Her fists pounded against the glass, each strike producing nothing but a dull thud. The fog outside blurred her reflection, turning her face into a ghost pressed against the surface. Behind her others shouted, their voices colliding into chaos, but Marcus did not turn. At the front his shoulders remained still, his grip locked around the wheel. His eyes did not blink. The fractured mirror above him showed only the split of his face, one shard still and calm, the other hollow. The hymn on the radio swelled, its voices rising just enough to overlap with the children's cries. The sound was unbearable, a layering of grief and terror, but he kept his eyes fixed forward. At 8:15 a.m., a boy in the middle row dragged his backpack to the aisle, lifted it, and swung it against the side window. The blow rang out sharply, the backpack falling with a dull thump. He tried again, harder this time, the straps tearing at his hands. The glass shuddered but did not break. Another child joined him, then another, their bodies pushing into the aisle, forming a small knot of desperate effort. Still the windows held. The panic spread like fire. Children crowded the exits, pressing against the sealed doors, their shoes slipping on the rubber floor. Some clawed at the seams with fingernails until they split. Others collapsed into their seats, sobbing, covering their ears against the noise. The air thickened with heat and the sharp scent of fear, a mix of sweat, vinyl, and diesel. At 8:18 a.m., the bus entered the long rise that led to the center span of the bridge. Outside, the fog grew denser, wrapping the steel in white so complete it seemed the bus was ascending into emptiness. Inside, the noise reached a fever pitch. A boy hammered his fists against the partition that separated the driver from the aisle. His strikes echoed hollow, a drumbeat of desperation. Marcus did not flinch. His breathing remained even, his gaze unbroken. The hymn repeated, its refrain dragging, funereal, pressing against the walls of the bus like an unwanted blessing. The crack in the mirror vibrated faintly with each strike from behind him, splitting his reflection deeper into two. At 8:20 a.m., one of the children slipped on the wet floor, her lunchbox skidding away and opening with a metallic snap. The contents scattered, an apple, a sandwich, a folded napkin with her mother's handwriting. She cried out louder than before, the image of home spilling across the floor of a bus that no longer carried her there. Others stumbled around her, their voices tightening into frantic pleas. The reinforced glass reflected their movements in faint distortions, showing their faces bent, stretched, blurred. It gave back no weakness, no break. The children saw themselves reflected as strangers, trapped in the steel shell of something that once promised safety. At 8:22 a.m., the bridge stretched forward, the fog parting enough to reveal its rails running parallel into the distance. Beneath them, the river swirled dark, a strip of water barely visible through gaps in the mist. The children fell quiet for a moment, their panic replaced by the heavy knowledge of where the road led. Only their sobs remained, uneven, fragile. Marcus pressed his foot deeper on the accelerator. The engine's growl rose, filling the cabin, drowning the voices until nothing remained but vibration. The hymn climbed again, its voices lifting in solemn unison, their mourning indistinguishable from triumph. In the fractured mirror, the crack reached the edge of the glass, splitting his face entirely in two. Behind him, the bus had become a cage of motion and sound, its passengers clawing at exits that no longer existed. Ahead of him, the rails of the bridge narrowed into a vanishing point, swallowed by fog. At 8:25 a.m., the bus surged forward. The children's cries rose once more, striking against steel and glass, muffled by the hymn, by the roar, by the indifference of the road. The bridge's midpoint loomed in the distance, but already the vehicle felt less like transport and more like a coffin in motion, sealed tight, carried forward by a driver who never looked back. At 8:27 a.m., the bridge swallowed them whole. Fog wrapped its steel skeleton, muting the world until nothing remained but the hum of tires and the hymn rising from the old radio. The bus climbed the incline, the engine straining, the vibration carrying through the seats into the children's spines. Their voices swelled again, no longer questions but raw pleas. Hands pounded against the partition, fists drummed on the glass, small bodies pressed into the aisle. One boy clawed his way toward the front, his face streaked with tears, his fist striking the panel that separated him from the driver. Others clung together in their seats, arms wrapped tight around one another, sobbing into jackets, their cries lost in the roar of the machine. The sound inside had become a single mass, screams, sobs, pounding, each swallowed by the unbroken thrum of the engine. At 8:28 a.m., Marcus shifted slightly in his seat. For the first time since the ride began, he turned his head halfway toward the rows behind him. His eyes swept across the children, their faces pale, streaked with fear. His mouth drew into a shape that was not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. His voice cut through the chaos with brutal clarity. "They never saw me, but they will see us now." The words froze the cabin. For a breath, even the crying stopped. Then panic surged again, louder than before, hands scrambling for escape that would not come. Shoes thudded against the walls, glass rattled under fists. The bus filled with a choking storm of sound. Marcus faced forward once more, his hands locking around the wheel, his foot pressing heavier onto the accelerator. At 8:29 a.m., the bus lunged. The engine roared, the tires whined against the asphalt, the cabin jolted as speed climbed beyond safety. The children tumbled in the aisle, their bodies thrown against seats, against each other. Voices rose into screams sharp enough to pierce the hymn now blaring from the speakers. The bridge stretched ahead, its rails converging into a narrowing path through fog. The sound of metal groaning came first, the vibration of the bridge under the weight of the bus at full force. The guardrail appeared in the headlights, its wet steel gleaming, a final line across the void. The children pressed back against their seats, eyes wide, mouths open in soundless horror. Some reached out blindly, grasping for anything solid. At 8:30 a.m. the impact came. The bus struck the guardrail with the violence of steel tearing against steel. Sparks exploded into the mist, bright orange arcs that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The sound was a scream of metal wrenched apart, bolts snapping, rail bending under the weight of the machine. For a fraction of a second, the bus seemed to hover. The front end lifted as the rear still clung to pavement, the entire vehicle tilting into the void. Inside, the children's screams reached their peak, filling every inch of air. Lunchboxes and backpacks flew into the aisle, colliding with seats and windows, scattering across the floor. Then gravity claimed everything. The rear tires lifted free. The yellow hull tilted forward, breaking fully from the bridge. The guardrail snapped away, curling into twisted fragments. The bus vanished into the fog, carried forward by momentum, its headlights carving two pale tunnels into emptiness. The fall was swift, merciless. The river rose dark and waiting, its surface broken only by ripples of current. The bus hit with a sound that was not a splash but a crash, metal against water with the weight of collapse. The surface erupted, waves rolling outward, fragments of rail and glass following into the depths. Inside, the windows fractured under the pressure, water surging through cracks, swallowing screams before they could escape. At 8:31 a.m., the river closed over the roof. Bubbles raced upward, breaking against the surface, then vanished. The bus sank quickly, pulled down by its own weight, yellow fading into black. The fog above sealed the scene, leaving only ripples spreading across the current. On the bridge, the twisted guardrail swung loose, droplets falling into the void. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. The fog erased the violence within seconds, hiding the river, hiding the wreckage. Only the echo of screams remained in memory, carried away by the hum of the current below. By 8:32 a.m. the bridge was empty once more, a line of steel stretching across fog, its surface wet and gleaming as though nothing had passed. But the broken section of rail marked the truth, jagged and gaping, pointing down into the water. And beneath that water, Bus 47 descended deeper, its windows dark, its cargo sealed. The river accepted it whole as it had accepted so many things before. The hymn still played faintly from the radio as the water filled the cabin, its voices distorted, gurgling until they faded altogether. The bus became silent, a coffin of steel settling on the riverbed, invisible from the world above. The bridge stood untouched in the mist, the broken rail gleaming wet in the pale light. It looked less like damage than like a wound that would never heal. And the fog thickened again, rolling across the steel frame, erasing even that. At 9 a.m. the river was still swollen with fog, its surface moving in slow swells that revealed nothing of the violence that had passed beneath. Rescue boats cut through the mist, their engines humming low, their searchlights probing the water with beams that dissolved after only a few feet. The broken guardrail above them hung like a wound, jagged steel dripping into the void, each drop swallowed instantly by the current. Divers slipped below, their black suits vanishing under the surface, lines trailing behind them like fragile lifelines. Hours dragged as the city gathered along the shore. Parents stood pressed against police barriers, their faces pale, their bodies wrapped in coats they did not feel. The crowd murmured at each boat's return, at each diver's rise, but the river gave back nothing. Only bubbles and silt surfaced, reminders of the weight that lay beneath. By 2 p.m. a diver's muffled voice broke through the radio static. They had found it. The bus lay tilted on its side in the deeper channel, half buried in mud, its yellow paint already dulled to green by the water. The windows were black, clouded with silt, but the outline was unmistakable. Cables were lowered, cranes set their steel arms against the fog, and the slow work of lifting began. At 5 p.m. the river erupted. The bus rose inch by inch, groaning, streams of water gushing from its windows in long sheets. Weeds clung to its sides, scraps of clothing and paper drifted away in the current. The crowd on the shore fell silent, their breaths held as if noise might sink it again. The roof broke the surface first, then the windows, then the torn front where the rail had struck. When it finally cleared the water, its bulk swung heavily, dripping black water back into the river that had held it. The interior was a scene of ruin. Lunchboxes floated between the seats, their contents spilled and half dissolved. Backpacks pressed against the ceiling, straps tangled like weeds. Tiny shoes were wedged beneath benches, their laces waving in the current as if still tied to moving feet. The air filled with the stench of diesel and river mud, a smell that clung to rescuers' suits long after they left the site. Marcus's body was found in the driver's seat, still upright, still strapped in. His hands rested where they had been when the bus left the bridge, his face slack, his eyes closed as though nothing had changed. In his jacket pocket they found the note, written in heavy strokes of pen that had carved grooves into the paper. Every mile I drove was a mile into invisibility. Now you'll remember my name. The words spread through the city faster than the news of the crash itself, quoted, dissected, condemned, whispered. By 8 p.m. candles were burning along the bridge. Parents pressed photos of their children against the guardrail, taped flowers to the twisted steel. The fog thickened again, wrapping the scene in pale smoke. The candles flickered within it like stars, fragile lights against a night that had come too early. Some parents cried openly, their voices carrying across the water. Others stood in silence, their faces hollow, their grief locked inside. The city fractured under the weight of what had happened. Newspapers called Marcus a mass murderer, headlines shouting his name alongside words like betrayal, monster, madness. Radio stations replayed his final sentence on loop. They never saw me, but they will see us now. To many it was proof of cruelty, a man who had turned trust into a weapon. Yet in smaller corners, whispers circulated among veterans who remembered his service. They spoke of a man broken by a system that had taken his loyalty and returned only neglect, a man erased until his only act of remembrance was destruction. At 10 p.m., the superintendent announced that Route 47 was retired. The number would never appear again on school maps. The buses were rerouted, the schedules rewritten, as if erasing the digits could erase the memory. But memory clung harder than ink. Children refused to board buses the next morning. Parents walked their sons and daughters to school instead, eyes darting toward every yellow vehicle with suspicion. In classrooms, teachers spoke in hushed voices, trying to explain without explaining, their words tangled between comfort and truth. The younger children asked why Mr. Reed had done it, why the man who once handed them sweets or waited for their late steps had turned into something they no longer recognized. No answer satisfied. In the silence of their questions lay the deeper wound, that trust once betrayed could never be mended. The bus itself was hauled to a secure lot on the edge of the city. Investigators combed through its wreckage, cataloging every bolt, every latch, noting how the emergency exits had been disabled, how the locks had been engaged. Each finding confirmed deliberation. This was no accident. The steel coffin had been sealed long before it struck the water. Weeks passed, but the memory did not fade. Each foggy morning brought it back, the way the mist curled around the bridge, the way the river swallowed sound. Parents whispered to one another at bus stops, their voices thin and sharp. School Bus 47. The words became less a description and more a curse, a name spoken as though it could summon the ghost of the event. By the first month's end, the crack in Marcus's apartment wall had widened to the floor. The landlord entered with contractors and found the table still covered in bills, the coffee mug unwashed, the notebook left open to its final page. They closed the apartment quickly, painted over the crack, scrubbed the floor. But some stains resist erasure. At 7 a.m. on the 30th day after the crash, the fog returned to the bridge, thick and unrelenting. Parents lit candles again, their flames trembling in the wind. The guardrail had been replaced, new steel shining bright, but to those who remembered it was already scarred. The water below moved as it always had, silent, dark, indifferent. The city continued, traffic rolling over the bridge each day, commuters staring through windshields at the place where the bus had gone through. But in the minds of those who had seen the aftermath, the fog never lifted. The number 47 was gone from maps, erased from schedules, but each morning mist brought it back, as if the air itself carried memory. School Bus 47 became less a vehicle than a story, told in whispers, passed between generations. It was no longer about Marcus Reed alone, but about the fragility of trust, about how quickly the mask of safety could split to reveal something unrecognizable beneath. Parents tightened their grip on their children's hands. Children pressed closer to their mothers at bus stops. And each time the fog rolled thick over the bridge, the city seemed to pause, waiting for the sound of an engine that would never return and fearing that it might.